Good day, pioneers. Today we are continuing with our exceptional educator interviews, and today I have none other but the phenomenal Mike Matthews with me. He is going to tell you about all the things he's done thus far in education, and then we will begin our conversation. Mike?
Hi, everyone. I am Mike Matthews, and just to give a little bit of a brief bio, this will be year 12 in education for me coming up, although I was involved in education as a substitute teacher 3 or 4 years before that while I was earning my master's degree in elementary education. And it's just so nice to be here. Dr. Townsend, thank you for the opportunity. So I started at Richardson Park Elementary as a 5th grade teacher. I bounced around a bit there between doing a homeroom and doing special education resource room. I taught at Warner Elementary for a year. I taught at Cook Elementary for a year, and they were during times when I was president of the local union, the Local Educator Association. I spent about 1.5 years as president of the state association, and now I'm back in the classroom at Skyline Middle School, where I am absolutely in love, working with 7th grade students with IEPs. It's a bit of a bubble year, so next year I will be moving on up to 8th grade, and hopefully I'll be traveling with some of my students doing English ELA resource room with them. So that's a bit of a brief bio on me, where I am, where I've come from, and I'm just happy to be here.
Yes, and I am so happy to have you. One of the reasons you came to mind for me was the fact that you've had varying experiences from elementary school to middle school, from urban communities to suburban communities. And every time I speak with you, you're always in love with what you're doing. And that means a lot. That speaks to me. And
you gotta be. I mean,
yes.
you have to be.
Yes. So what was your initial philosophy of education, and how has it changed over the course of your career?
When I entered, and I actually think I answered that question on my first job interview back in the summer of 2009, where I was interviewed by a team at Richardson Park Elementary. And they asked me what was my philosophy of education. And I probably, I was young, I think I was 26. I probably gave some kind of canned answer because I didn't have the experience. I probably said something flowery, but, asking me that question almost a dozen years later, my philosophy on education is that my philosophy changes based on everything that I learn every day from my students, from my coworkers, and being able to absorb the rapid changes around me and shift my own mindset and have that kind of that flexibility, that fungibility to change my philosophy, I think is key. I mean, some of the basic pieces of my philosophy of education are: all children can learn, all children must learn, all children will learn. And that's kind of the philosophy that I allow to guide me in my classroom, being a special education teacher. There can be far more challenges working with my population of students who, they might be there for, an intellectual disability. They may be in my classroom for a behavioral need, an emotional need, and I've got a bunch of students with autism. So recognizing that my philosophy and my guide to back up that philosophy are going to be the true indicators of whether or not they succeed. Their ability is one thing, but if I don't believe they can, must, and will learn, then they're not going to learn. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, you know, if I feel like they're going to be able to do these things, then we're going to get there. And that's kind of my philosophy.
And I love that you said it that way, because it reminded me of a video I saw of Marva Collins. And I pulled this background up for that purpose. Trust yourself, think for yourself, act for yourself, speak for yourself, be yourself. Imitation is suicide. And being authentic with our children, they definitely know, they can feel it, they are aware. And you're teaching special education. And my next question for you was, what are your thoughts concerning the number of students who are referred for special education these days?
This is a tough one. I think it's almost, to me, it's almost like a net zero game we're playing. I do feel like we can over-identify at times, but I also feel like we can under-identify at times. And where I feel that we under-identify is I don't know in those earlier grades that we're really picking things up as quickly as possible. And one of those reasons, wow, I'll get a little political, is the state doesn't actually fund K-3 special education for students identified with basic needs. So it could be that we're not identifying because we know that we don't get the funding for it. But you know, that's changed over the last few years as legislation has been introduced to get this funded. Because I believe with early identification, we can stave off a lot of problems down the line. You know, the number of students in special ed these days, that's my specialty. I have, last year I had about 16 to 20 kids that I saw on a daily basis in my resource room. It worked pretty well. We had our challenges, we had our fun, but I you know, I don't know that I'm so much focused on numbers as I am the qualitative data. Why are students being referred? Do they need the services? And then if they're not being referred, you know, how are they truly getting what they need to meet their own kind of personal achievement goals that maybe they haven't realized within themselves yet, that kind of have to be teased out of them. So, you know, the number of special ed kids, the students in special education these days, it's certainly gone up in the last decade. And we've seen that with a lot of our staffing. Our staffing in Red Clay, in my district and others, has increased dramatically because of special ed identification. I think there are always tweaks to our identification system that can be made to make sure we're getting the right kids and that we're not over-identifying because of maybe cultural barriers that we have placed around the system, where we identify students with behaviors that some of us in the teaching majority, I guess I should say white teachers, believe is needing special ed services, versus if we're just not changing our mindset to meet their needs in a different way that don't necessarily require an IEP.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But when we say meet their needs, I think we have to look at what we are considering those needs to be as well. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we look at assessment, because all of these conversations are based on lots of assessments that we give children, right? So we'll get there, but you mentioned intellectual, behavioral. You mentioned one other that I was trying to capture on paper, and then you said
Emotional.
autism. Emotional, thank you.
Emotional, yeah.
Emotional. Because, you know, we're doing a lot of trainings these days on being trauma informed. And from your experience, what do you believe are some of the primary causes of the number of students with varying issues? So we have ADHD, we have ODD, we have anxiety-related disorders. And then we have the autisms, the varying levels of trials that we're finding that we need to address in addition to academics.
Yeah, and this is a great question. I will always just preface this saying, you know, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
I just have about a dozen years of observation up here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the primary causes for some of these, you know, potentially debilitating issues, ADHD, ODD, anxiety, can certainly have impacts in the classroom. You know, I look at it again as kind of attempts of the cultural majority to diagnose or place labels on certain behaviors and students that they may not be used to working with, which can lead to overdiagnosis in my mind. But you know, the primary causes, I think there can be just cultural differences that not all of us make ourselves aware of in how different communities live, thrive, celebrate, raise kids, raise families, and we then get them in our classroom, get students in our classroom that we just don't understand. So we quickly go down this diagnosis route, this medicine route. Look, I'm also going to say this. I think we've seen an increase in the number of these conditions. I'm not going to be the guy up here saying technology is bad. I mean, look, technology has moved us in so many amazing directions, scientifically, medically, socially in some ways. Well, I think we've socially regressed in some ways. But
yeah,
when I have to step in repeatedly, sometimes and say, you know, put your phone away, put your phone away, put your phone away. I believe that there is that just need, and some of us adults have it too, the attachment to the devices that cause us to lose sense of where we are, what we should be doing, what we should be prioritizing. I do believe that technology has played a part, and it's not always been for the better. That can metastasize some of these issues in students. So, but you know, it's a good question. It's a tough question, but it's a good question.
Thank you. It is a tough question, but I'm loving the variety of answers. I think we need to really explore all of these answers. And one of the things you said that stuck out for me is what we should be prioritizing, because I do feel like the cultural majority that you mentioned sets up a system for us and tells us that we should be able to operate within this system. And then everyone who's not able to manage that system that was created is considered abnormal in some way, right?
Yeah.
But maybe it's just the system that was abnormal and everyone else is doing just fine.
I agree. Yes.
So let's start to unravel some of those things. That's what these conversations are about. Now, what strategies do you find to date to be most effective in combating the undesirable student behavior?
So, look, this was my first year teaching middle school. And middle school is often described as the most challenging grade band.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these kids, middle school, all middle schoolers, every one of them, it's wild up here. There are explosions in their brain every 15 seconds. The hormones, the adolescence. I mean, I would never want to go back there again. And as a principal that I had about a decade ago, he said in a faculty meeting at the beginning of the year, look, kids are going to do dumb things. They're just going to do dumb things. So it's our role as adults to kind of set the environment, set the mood early on and with consistency to let kids know you're going to do dumb things. There's probably going to have to be consequences, but we're going to be as consistent and fair as possible. So, you know, strategies that I use, and they don't always work, which is why you kind of need to have an arsenal of them to whip something else out if they don't work. I think setting the tone is key. At the beginning of every school year, you have to really try and set the tone. And I had some very fun, challenging students in my classes this year who tested me. But I found that they always relied on me to execute something consistently and fairly with them if there had to be some level of discipline. So some strategies that worked for me at the beginning of the year: kind of work with the class to set classroom expectations. What are some things, what kind of rules or expectations do you students feel like we should have? And then let's talk about each one as a whole group, and we'll either be like, this one isn't going to work, or, let's add it to the list. And then constantly referring back to that throughout the year, I think, is key. Realizing another strategy of mine is that I work really hard never to shame a student publicly. That's one of those things early on as a teacher that I failed at in my first year or two.
Me too.
Because I was so new. I was young. I didn't know what the heck I was doing.
Because teachers shamed us. So that's kind of what we thought. Yeah, that's kind of what we thought was the way.
And we're modeling what we experienced. We're modeling what we knew. So, being in a classroom with only 8 or 9 students each period, and having other wonderful adult supports in the classroom. My paraprofessionals are awesome. You just kind of let's be discreet. Let's go up directly to a student, tap them on the shoulder. Hey, what's going on? What are you doing? How can we do better? How and I use the collective, the we, from time to time, because it lets them know that, maybe it's not just them who's part of the problem, but I want to include me. How can we do better? Knowing full well that it is you. You're the one acting up, and this, it's you. I'm gonna include we because it's less. It gives them cause to be less defensive if they know that I'm saying we, if I'm including myself in the situation. So having one-on-one chats is critical. In my classroom, many of my students with autism or emotional needs, they sometimes have cards where they get to leave. They get to leave with their para, go for a 5-minute walk. And, even if they didn't have that pass, I'm not the teacher to want to get in a fight with a student. I'm not going to have this battle with you. If you want to go out for a walk with a para, or even just by yourself, go out, sign the pass. I'm not going to argue with you. Go ahead. So I think knowing which battles to pick is a strategy itself when dealing with undesirable behaviors in the classroom. And the final one is, you just got to build relationships. If you don't build relationships early and often, then you're not going to have one later, or the one you're going to have is going to be negative, and it's going to make the year miserable for everyone. So that's it.
Yes, agreed. I just did a video on building the family atmosphere within the classroom, and you spoke to that. You talked about environment, setting the mood, and I wanted to challenge you on consistent and fairness, because I wrote down consistent / fair versus equity. Because how can we be consistent when every child needs something different?
Yes.
But you spoke to that. You spoke to the building of relationships and how in each situation it's going to vary. And the we is so important, and you joked and you made light, but a lot of times, I find being vulnerable with my students is so critical, because when I say we, it does show that even though I'm an educator and I know what I'm doing, I can always grow as well. So in this situation, what do I need to do to be the best person for you? So that's going to require a we.
excuse me, I like your point about equity. And I guess I should clarify. The consistency, I mean, is with each student. Each student comes to me with something different. So I know I had one student this year in one of my ELA classes, was there for some behavioral issues, nothing academic. He was reading on an 11th grade level. Brilliant kid. He needed something different when it came to discipline and consequences than some of my other students. So when I said consistency, I meant kind of being consistent with each student with what they need.
Correct.
But equity is the key ultimately, because trust me, in my resource room, every kid needs something different. And you gotta do some of that collectively when setting classroom expectations, but then you gotta do some of it individually, and that's critical.
Right. It's such a balancing act. So what do you find are the most important aspects of education as it relates to true student growth?
Oh, I think the most important aspect and maybe I'll look cumulatively versus, because this year was very different for me. This year was new. It was middle school. I was in a resource room, and never before have I received a cohort of students with such a varying level of needs. So when I taught my 5th grade homeroom 11 years ago, it was very straightforward. 95% of my kids were accessing the curriculum. About 80% of them were on grade level or above. So it was easy to use some of the assessments that we're required to give to show that growth. And moving forward 11 years, I think that true growth comes, in my mind, in everything that I've done over the years, from observation. I have to be able to observe it. Some of the growth that I've observed over the years are like intangibles. Like you can't, it can't be done in a test. It can't necessarily be done in an essay or a writing assignment or a project, but the growth is, when I'm walking around the classroom and I can engage in a conversation on a topic, and just part of that is building the relationship, but have that conversation with a student and be like, okay, we're there.
Yep.
It took us 74 days, but we're there. Keep it there. Keep it there, because retention, a lot of the student growth with my kids is the tough part is the retention. The retention is not there. The executive functioning, the memories, and that's what's challenging. But having that ability to observe and see where they were, where they are, and where they are now is to me how I can judge true student growth. Now, of course, when you're in the faculty meeting or the PLC, that's not what your boss is asking you for. So, we have these checkpoints throughout the year where I have to give grade level assessments, common assessments. And I mean, the challenging thing about, and I think you've got an assessment question down here somewhere, but the challenging thing about those systems is that those common assessments designed by the district, every district probably, are not designed for my students. They're just the assessments. The information and a lot of the skills my students can learn, but the presentation and expectation within those systems of assessment are not always for my students, because they come to my room, they come to me with such a variance of abilities, basic knowledge, and skills to get them to where they need to be, that it's a standardized system for non-standardized kids,
And I would say non-standardized teachers as well, because
yes.
I will speak to the fact that I need my teacher's manual to know the answers half the time. And I'm an intelligent woman with lots of accomplishments under my belt, but I don't understand the questions myself half the time.
Yes, I
And
agree.
that's unfortunate. And I'm just being honest. I'm peeling back a layer. I think we need to take a look. Why do I expect a 10-year-old to do what I can't do at 40 plus? Okay.
You are, and look, I've got it, right here is one of the, you can't even see it. It's a white piece of paper with one of the questions from the online learning we had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, at RCEA, our union, for those who don't know, we had to kind of go back and forth with the district saying, can you just give us the answer keys? Because a lot of parents want them, and we finally got them. But a lot of our teachers, for some of these reading comprehension questions, it's not as simple as it appears. I mean, this can be tough stuff. So your vulnerability on that, I'm right there with you. Like, sometimes I need the answer keys.
Yes, and we are taught to go deeply into the smarter questions, the smarter bank.
Yes.
To kind of get a feel for the questions and know the thinking and the reasoning behind the questions. And I've spent lots of time, hours on hours, inside of those question banks, and have disagreed with the right answer at times.
Yeah.
And brought that to my PLC and said, this is why I think C is the right answer versus B. Yes. So if I'm feeling that way as a 27-year veteran in education, how do our little people feel? And that, you're right, that is my very next question. How relevant and or effective do you think our standardized testing system is?
Look, I mean, I've been fighting this system both as a teacher and as a union leader for almost the past decade, with a lot of people to varying levels of success and failure. Although I think, look, my predecessor, Frederica Jenner, who I just absolutely adore, past president of DSCA and longtime Red Clay teacher.
Absolutely.
When policymakers would say to her, why do you want to get rid of tests? Why do you think tests aren't important? Frederica would say, no, teachers invented tests. We invented tests. We do not hate testing. We know that there has to be assessment of some sort to gauge both whether the student is learning and whether we are teaching what that student needs to learn.
Correct.
Where I have always fallen is I find standardized tests to, one, be a waste of money. I think our state spends $5 million a year on the Smarter Balanced Assessment. That could get us upwards of 50 teachers, and we need those jobs. I find standardized tests to be culturally biased. Again, written from the perspective of what I will say, the cultural majority in this country, the white majority. I don't think that they take into account the experiences of Black and brown folks, and they're biased. And I don't think that Black and brown communities score lower on the test necessarily because it's an ability issue. I think it's because the questions can be culturally biased. There was a question on the test a few years ago that kind of went national. The reading passage was about a parasail. And I'm a white dude. I'm like, a parasail? I mean, kids who are living in densely populated areas, what the heck are they going to know about a parasail? It's cultural bias. And kids, we know as teachers, kids can get hung up reading a passage if they can't say the name of a character. So they will get so confused and wrapped up in the name of that character, and I'll say, just make it Sarah, just make it Mike, just make it any name. But they get so caught up in the name of that character that they can't see the rest of the question. So, our students are getting so caught up on some of these culturally irrelevant questions on standardized tests, and then they're being told that they're not proficient. Their teachers are being told that they're not doing their jobs. So the whole system is just, but I do think we need some kind of system to show, because I'm a data guy, we need some kind of system to show where the deficiencies are so that certain populations don't go neglected. So that we have the data to show, you know, our spec ed kids are only scoring at a statewide level 12% proficient. Our ELL kids are only scoring, 22%. Our Black boys are only scoring 33%. Our white girls are scoring 76%. So we need that data to show the deficiencies so we can continue to hammer and grill and ask the questions, why? Why do we see these gaps in achievement? I don't like the standardized testing system that we have in Delaware. I do think we need some kind of test. I just don't think this or the whole concept is the right one at this point in history.
Yes, I agree with you. I'd really like to do some studies of other countries. We always hear about Singapore and how much they value their teachers. Teachers are paid on a scale of doctors and lawyers, and given that reverence. And they are within the top 10 nationwide, and America is 27th. That's what the statistic was 3 years ago. And I don't know where we are today. I'll need to research that. But 27th is pretty darn low. But based on what measure, what universal measure are we even getting that statistic from? Because It's not Smarter Balance. You know, Delaware uses Smarter Balance. Pennsylvania has the
Keystones. Is it the Keystones or the, what's the other one? Smarter Balanced.
It just slipped my mind, but I'm familiar with it.
About.
Yes, when we were growing up, it was the California Achievement Test.
Yes, I remember the California Achievement Test.
It's always some acronym, and the acronym for Pennsylvania will come to me. But again, we're using various measures. So how do we even measure from state to state?
Correct. That's my issue. And one of the controversies is that we have these politicians who love citing the PISA test, PISA, formed standardized test that's given to a cohort of, I believe it's of students in every country in the world. And China keeps coming out on top. But it's not an apples to oranges comparison, because China, education in the United States is compulsory. Every student is expected to go to school. Whereas in China, students are tracked and a lot of them are not going to school. So the data right there is skewed. And I can't recall how many politicians I had to talk to when they would post on their Facebook, why is the United States so low and China is number one on this PISA test? I'm like, well, you need to take a look at the asterisks and the footnotes and see that China is not testing all of their students. They're testing the best of the best. So look, we got a lot of work to do here in the United States, a lot. But comparing us to a country that pulls a different cohort of students for their testing, it's not fair to us. And then you as a politician making decisions based on that data, that's malpractice.
Wow. Agreed. And when you talked about that test, it reminded me of NAEP, which we do every other year. And that's a national federal test, right? Fourth grade, I'm not sure.
Fourth and eighth, yep.
Fourth and eighth. And it's a selection of the students.
Yeah.
So there again, we have skewed data. And the Pennsylvania test is called the PSSA.
The PSSA, yes. That's it.
Yes. So I certainly want to continue with that conversation and how we can look at more authentic assessment. One that was mentioned in another interview that I did was project-based learning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and project-based learning is still kind of in its burgeoning stages. You know, it's this idea of let's not focus on, you know, 60, 70, 80, 100 lessons throughout the year, and let's focus on maybe 4, 5, or 6 big ideas, and then grow out through there and try and hit on all of the standards and skills we need to with these big projects that may take some time to get done. And, you know, in my classroom this year, we did a little bit of that. Attention spans could be a little challenging in my class, but we did a little of that on topics like we did some civil rights work. We did some activities surrounding drama and stage and using this play called Sorry, Wrong Number. But kind of these bigger units, and then within them, these kind of little mini lessons to just keep the kids engaged, keep them going. But I think project-based learning is something that's going to be embraced a lot more in coming years. Absolutely.
I believe so too, because as we look at the standards, and there are thousands of them, you know, that have to be clustered, and we struggle to teach them in the course of 10 months because there are just that many of them. How many are antiquated? How many have value as we look at the world and how it's moving forward and what we need? What are our needs as a society? And what should we be focusing on in education? One of the things that I find fascinating is history, and how history is being made every second of every day. So then it becomes a challenge when you have the 4 strands: civics, geography,
economics,
history, and history just being one of those 4 strands, and trying to fit a lifetime in to 45 minutes, which becomes 35 minutes when
yes. and also, who's written the history?
Correct.
I mean, that's where we as educators have got to be discriminating, in the sense that we have to evaluate information and materials to make sure that what we're being given by our curriculum department is culturally competent, is written from a perspective that considers everyone who was involved at the time, which we know, considering some things that have gone down in the last 2 months, is that history has not been written with all of those perspectives. But you're right, there is so much we need to hit on as educators, and there's so much coming at us and so much coming at our kids, that it's just, I feel like we are learning just as much as our students are.
Absolutely, all the time. And I love it. I love being a lifelong learner.
Yes. Never.
So my next question is, what do you feel is most needed in education today? And this kind of goes into the next question, which is in terms of educational policy, because I think whatever is needed, we need to create some legislation around it.
These are very broad questions, and I love them because they'll give me an opportunity to ramble. So, most needed in education today, I think we need more patience from our public.
Ooh.
I don't, we need a lot of work in our schools. We need a lot of work in our schools, but I just don't feel like the public, and the public collectively, you know, when it just fascinates me when you ask parents individually, how is your kid's school? I gotta say, 8 times out of 10, they're gonna say, oh, my child loves his or her teacher. I think they're doing great. You know, I show up when I can, but we have this groupthink as a society where when you turn on a radio show, or when you go onto a Delaware online news thread and it's something about education, 90% of the comments are just negative, negative, negative. I don't think that we get the patience as a system in terms of what we're trying to do. But I mean, I also get that the system has failed a lot of kids, and I'm willing to concede that. But when I say patience, I just think that there is such a negative view of what public education is and could be, is this generalized misanthropy. I mean, of people who just thrive on hating on public education. Like, you know, Christina School District passed a referendum last month that was very controversial. I mean, you wouldn't know it by the results because they won in a landslide. But I mean, I almost feel like it's this cycle of abuse in a way where you see these people saying, no, I don't want to raise my taxes another $9 a month because the school system is a failure. But then I say to myself, okay, if the referendum doesn't pass, they're going to lay off 200 teachers. They're not going to have band or sports or extracurriculars. Class sizes at the elementary level are going to balloon to 35. You're saying the system is a failure. But how do we correct failure if you defund our public school system and leave them in the condition that I just mentioned? They're surely going to fail. So you can either sit back, complain, vote no in a referendum, or you can start going to school board meetings, citizen financial review committee meetings, demanding accountability for your extra $9 a month that you're paying in property taxes. So I'd like to see a public that, if they're going to be so critical, and trust, they have every right to be critical, but just because something is right doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. If you're going to be that critical, show up, volunteer, mentor at a school, see what's really going on. And then in terms of educational policy, I think we need to fight for a more equitable funding system, a funding system that acknowledges disparities in experiences that students are bringing to our schools. You know, we have this thing in Delaware called the unit count system that a lot of states don't have, and Delaware in some ways is in a better shape than a lot of states, because state code guarantees that if your school has a number of students showing up, you're going to earn a number of teaching units. So there's stability in that system. I think we need to keep that system, but add on to it. And we need to add on for students living in poverty. We need to add on for English language learners, because Delaware is one of only 4 states that does not fund English language learners.
Wow.
Yes, and we need to better fund special education, because the data shows us that it's our students coming to us from, you know, often trauma impacted, impoverished homes, our English language learners, and our students with disabilities who need more. So we need a funding system that is responsive to those needs. And that, I think, to your question, would bring a positive change for children and educators, because we'd have the resources to meet the needs of our students. You know?
Thank you. And that brings me back. I had written down child find. Earlier on, you mentioned about early identification. And I remember when my son was entering kindergarten and he went through the child find process. Are you saying that program is no longer in existence, or it's in existence but not funded?
It's in existence and it's funded, because child find is generally used for students who are 2-3 years old, who may be showing cognitive delays. So the state does fund that. We actually have some teachers in Red Clay who go out to daycare centers and administer child find tests. And then, you know, they call the parents in and, oh, we think your child may qualify. to come into one of Red Clay's early years programs with an IEP, and that's funded. That is funded by the state with some support from the federal government. I think what I was talking about was, are we under-identifying kids who maybe hit those cognitive milestones, but have other issues that don't manifest until later? That if we had known about them earlier, see, it's such a challenging system. If we had known about them earlier, could we have identified and gotten supports? And it can be very depressing to receive a student in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, or even high school that has had 2 or 3 years of challenges, when maybe if we had slowed down a bit, because we're all just racing. We're racing to that test. If we had slowed down a little bit, maybe we would have said, oh, you know what, maybe we need to get that paperwork signed and just get you some testing with the psychologist. That could have made the difference. It could have made a difference,
Absolutely. I agree. Wow, this has been very enlightening. And I thank you. I thank you for enlightening educators everywhere.
You're just wonderful, Dr. Townsend. You are a North Star. You are so much fun, and I appreciate everything that you do, and all of that the racial and social justice stuff that you've been putting up recently, and it's time. Past time.
Yes, thank you. And I'll share a quote that means a lot to me is from Albert Einstein. It says, "I'm thankful to all those who said no." I'm looking at my board here. I keep this here for inspiration. "I'm thankful to all those who said no. It's because of them that I did it myself." So I earned my doctorate in educational leadership at Wilmington University in 2005. And I just am going to continue to lead in education in one way, shape, or form, because I believe it's my calling.
I'm right there with you.
And regardless of every no I receive in any form or fashion, I continue to find another way to be an influence.
I love that quote. And, it can be really hard sometimes saying no to your student or a family member. But if they realize that the no has a purpose, then they're going to be okay.
Yes, and I've had to be okay with the no's I've received. They make me stronger. They build my character.
More. Correct. Yes. Oh, this was so nice. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you again for participating. In closing, do you have any go-to books that you would like for other educators to be aware of?
Let me just say, the book that I've used the last few years for my own practice has Fostering Resilient Learners, which I know that the district bought a bunch of copies of this past school year. I read it 3 or 4 years ago. It's a great book on how to integrate trauma-informed practices in your classroom. But more so than that, it gets you to understand that your students are never going to come to your class how you would like them to come to your class. You are going to get students with experiences that are just all over the place. And you have to recognize those experiences and modify your own worldview to meet them where they are, and then work with them to see that they succeed. Then the other go-to books that I have, I'm a policy guy. I love politics. So my favorite education author is Diane Ravitch, and her books, The Death and Life of the American Public School System, amazing. Amazing.
Can you spell Ravitch?
Ravitch, Ravitch.
Okay.
And her book that came out 2 years ago called Slaying Goliath and it kind of looks at the standardized testing industry. It's really, really good. But she's wonderful. Yes, she is.
Wow. So I wrote that down, and I'll be getting a copy of that. And then we'll have to reconvene.
Yes, we'll have a book club.
So as an educational leader, I'm sure that folks will want to be reaching out to you for speaking engagements and workshops and things of that nature. How can you be reached?
I think the easiest is just my email, Mike Matthews, DE, all one word, of course, Mike Matthews, DE @gmail.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, it has been my pleasure to have you, and I thank you for joining us. And stay tuned as the Exceptional Educators volumes continue to grow.
Thank you, Dr. Townsend. You're wonderful.